Hey, good morning, guys. Unfortunately, this could have devastating impacts because TSA and FAA workers are deemed essential. So for national security reasons, even if the government does shut down, they do have to come in to work and work without pay. The last time there was a government shutdown in 2019, a large number of these workers called out sick for multiple days. Funding will expire midnight on Friday if Congress does not come to an agreement. That could really throw a wrench in airline travel, impacting the 50,000 TSA agents and 13,000 air traffic controllers. If many of these workers do call out, the U.S. Travel Association says security and baggage claim wait times could skyrocket. If there is a shutdown, the Travel Association suggests that 6 in 10 Americans would consider canceling their flight. Now, that means more people would have to drive to their destinations. Now, this would cause even more traffic on the roads.
Every metropolitan area is going to be extremely busy between noon and 6 p.m. Starting your trip as early as possible is really smart. Give yourself a lot of time and be patient because there's going to be a lot of people on the road.
So if the shutdown happens, the U.S. Travel Association predicts that it would cost the travel economy at least $140 million per day. AAA says even if the government stays open, you can expect there to be pretty long wait times at TSA and baggage claim because 4.7 million Americans will be traveling by plane, 55 by car, and 1.1 million Arizonans traveling in general. So, guys, expect a very busy holiday. Not sure what your plans are, but I guess we all have to pack our patience.
That's fact.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sarah.